followed by Catherine Coumans, who's with Mining Watch in Ottawa now.
Yes.
Yes, in Ottawa, and has been researching a lot on various issues related to socially responsible investments, human rights, and a whole range of campaigns that intersect with mining issues, and particularly Canadian mining capital and its international activity.
So yeah, I am gonna take it down quite a ways. I'm still processing everything I've just heard, and it may end up changing the way I would write this piece in the future. But I am going to take it down quite a bit. I'm going to take it down right down to the level of actually engaging with these SRIs, engaging with these the real people who are in these SRI firms, and the disappointing reality of that engagement. So I just want to thank Kevin, first of all, for inviting me to present at this important workshop series that is exploring the challenging relationships between union pension funds and the project, if we want to call it that, of social transformation towards greater social justice that, you know, we do have as a project, I think, those of us sitting here. Those who attended the first workshop will realize that there are growing tensions in historical efforts to use the pooled resources in the pension funds of traditionally activist organizations, such as unions, to transform capitalism's more exploitative aspects and to push for social change and social justice. One of the promising vehicles, and it's funny that I even still think of it this way, but one of the promising vehicles for such social change that came to greater prominence in the 1980s was that of shareholder activism. I think that was an optimistic moment, that perhaps if we did pool our resources and then became active shareholders, we could actually change the world. So as the background to this workshop sets out, in the 1980s, the churches first started to consider how their own investments, because they did have money, they were capitalists. I don't know where the churches fit in there, the little guy with the cigar, I guess, in some sense. But they did have money, and they started to be worried about how that money was invested and what that was doing in the world. And that did lead to pretty grassroots type of shareholder activism. And from that humble beginning, though, and I think with quite amazing speed, really, if we're talking about the 1980s to now, this so-called responsible investment, or SRI, socially responsible investment industry, has sprung up. And it is now big business. It is an industry. And you notice that when you get on the wrong side of it, as we ended up doing in the end. So by the end of 2008, responsible investments in Canada had grown to $609 billion, and now that sounds like a very small amount after hearing trillions thrown around. I thought this was an impressive amount of money. So this is money that's under management by the so-called SRI firms, such as those listed here, and this is just some of the bigger ones. The Ethical Funds Company has the word ethical right in it, now part of Northwest and Ethical Investments. And then there's others. So these sorts of firms supposedly screen our investments on the basis of environmental, social, and governance (ESG) that we heard about earlier criteria. And then there's other firms that sort of float around all of this, and they provide services, education, research, and proxy voting services, so that people can actually try to influence the behavior of a company. So that's a big one is Share, and then there's Gency Sustainalytics, which also has its own funds as well. So it gets a little more complicated. But these are already kind of big business in my world anyway. So now to bring this down, you might wonder why somebody from an NGO like Mining Watch Canada even got tangled up in all of this in the first place. But we were founded in 1999, and we're still very small, but we were tiny then. We were one full-time person and two half-time people who worked full-time on weekends and tried to keep this little thing going. And we had limited funding, we still do, and a really large mission. And our large mission was to try to hold Canadian mining companies to account for their violations of human rights and worker rights and environmental, unacceptable environmental impacts and practices, not just in other countries, but also in Canada. So we had to deal with all mining in Canada and everything that Canadian mining companies were doing overseas. And we were swamped, we were overwhelmed, and we realized we needed to find allies, we needed to find good people who cared about things like this as well, we thought. And so as we went around looking for natural allies, we ended up in some conversations with some of these folks from Share and some of these folks from the Ethical Fund Company, and we thought, oh, you know, this is good. These people understand finance, and mining has a lot of complicated finance, and they are good people, and they care about making a difference. And they were really interested in us, because what we had was the knowledge of what the companies were doing wrong. And they were very keen to talk to us, and they really wanted to pick our brains, and they really wanted us to send us documents, and they would regularly get in touch and say what's going on the ground in the Philippines or Papua New Guinea or wherever. And we were freely providing this information because we thought they would do good things with this. And of course, at the same time, we started to realize that they hold really, really, really large amounts of shares in companies that we were increasingly getting to know as really bad actors, dealing with the impacts of these companies on our local partners around the world, and yet these ethical funds were holding these companies. So we sort of went, okay, you know, let's talk about that as well. And then of course they explained that, well, no, that's okay, because by holding these shares, we can actually engage these companies, and then we can make a difference. And so back in 99, 2000, 2001, we were having these conversations. We were like, okay, cool, well, we want to be part of that. We want to help you make a difference. And so we actually got quite deep into these conversations. Like, we actually sat down with them and went through our portfolio of bad companies and bad things happening around the world, and said, you know, what are the worst things, and what should we focus on? And we would, you know, present them with as much information as we could, and then they would go off behind closed doors and start talking to the companies. And well, there was a couple of things that happened. One was that, like, sort of 10 years on, there were very specific things that we had identified. Like, for example, Canadian Mining Company in Papua New Guinea dumping its tailings into an 800-kilometer-long river system that leads right from the highlands of Papua New Guinea to the sea, something that would be absolutely illegal in Canada. And so one of these firms, Ethical Fund, said, okay, that's a great one. You know, we'll put that in a shareholder resolution, and we'll make sure that that stops. And 10 years later, it was still happening, but they were also still holding the company. And so we're sort of like, well, what happens when they don't do what you say they should do? You know, you've got all this power, but then they don't do it, and it's sort of 10 years later, and we've been very patient. And then we said, was that when you divest? You know, is that when you get tough with them? And they sort of went, oh, no, that's never a good idea. You know, we just keep talking. And sort of, And then at the same time, another thing started happening. So that's just kind of disappointing, right? But then another thing started happening. We started actually getting more and more communities that we were working with closely, that were our partners and allies and what we were campaigning together with, getting really upset by shareholder resolutions that seemed to come out of nowhere. And so these were where the company actually puts forward a resolution. I hope this is a familiar terminology. You know, uses the shares to put forward a resolution. Let me see if I just need to actually flip slides here. Yeah, I should. Yeah, and I just want to quickly look at some of the, you know, this was, of course, the rhetoric that we were getting, and that was also on the website of the Ethical Funds Company. And this really goes to what Jim was saying before, like, you can have it all. You can have your cake and eat it too. You can make money and you can make a difference. Money is energy. Energy creates change, making good companies better. So they would never say we're actually holding really scuzzy, horrible companies. No, we're holding good companies. We're just going to make them a little better, you know. You can't change a company you don't own. So this is, you know, like, hey, you have to be in there. You got to own this company. You know, if you divest, you get nothing left. But the reality we found, you know, like I was saying, 10 years down the road, is it's business as usual, both for the mining companies who are still dumping their tailings in the river and still have their security guards raping and pillaging, and it was business as usual for the responsible investors, or the SRIs. But it was good public relations for both. And what we started to realize that was really, this works out really well, this dynamic, because the companies could actually go to meetings where people would be trying to hold them to account and say, you're a terrible company, you're doing all these things. And they'd say, it can't be a terrible company because the Ethical Funds Corporation has us on their list, and they screen out bad companies. And so if they hold us, then we must be a good company. And it was really annoying to us to actually have that be used as an argument to prove, like, we're on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. Well, anyone and their dog can be on the Dow Jones Sustainable Index. The worst companies are on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. It is rare that anybody ever divests from a company, and the Norwegian Pension Fund was doing it, and we were all over the Norwegian Pension Fund, and we loved them, but, you know, they're even sort of seeming to back out a little bit now. But it was also good business for the responsible investment groups, because the companies relied on them to give them the stamp of approval, and they relied on the companies to be able to say to the world, well, we're talking to these people and we're being tough on them, and that would give them their raison d'etre to say, as Canadians, if you care about these things, give us your money because we're being really tough with these guys. And the companies would actually argue, and I've seen academics pick this up, which annoys me no end. The companies would actually argue, the ones who are really making us change, the ones we really listen to are those SRIs. They really got us, where they want us, and it's really annoying to hear that, because we know that that's not true, that they aren't actually changing anything. But the companies will give kudos to the SRIs for really understanding how to talk their language and make them listen and make them do things, and the SRIs will say, give us your money because we're making these companies change. But in fact, nothing's really changing. So, as I was saying, one part of the disappointment was that 10 years down the road, all the same bad things are still happening, and yet everybody's still invested. The SRIs are still invested in these companies. And the other one was this thing with problematic shareholder resolutions, where we were realizing that as they do their talking behind closed doors, what's really going on is this little dance where the SRI goes, look, I gotta be seen to be, putting you into the pliers, putting pressure on you, and but let's talk about what you don't mind so much having, maybe there's something that you want to do anyway. I mean, I'm really grossly exaggerating here, but it's that kind of a conversation, because they may go in with a particular position, but they come out with something completely different. Whereas if you're working on the ground and you know the communities and you know the particular problems a company has on the ground, you realize that what they came out with is actually something that's going to work out really well for the company. So for example, a community has just spent a lot of money, or found other people to find the money somehow, to get a water assessment done of a river that they believe is contaminated. And it's taken 2 years to get some university off the sides of their desk, a bunch of really great people to do this work, and they finally come out with this water assessment, and now they've got proof that the river's contaminated, and they think that's linked to their health problems and other problems, and they want to start making a fuss about this. Well, the company at this point goes, geez, it'd be really good if we could do an independent assessment of the river damage, and so suddenly a socially responsible or shareholder resolution comes out of the SRI saying, we're going to make this company do an independent assessment of the damage of that river. And the people on the ground are outraged, because they're saying, we just did an independent assessment. We already know what the problem is. And there were any number of these. And there was a series of them over the 10 years, sort of between 2001 and when we started having a serious conversation with them about this. So there was some on Placer Dome, operations in the Philippines and Papua New Guinea, Alcan in India. Oh my God. Okay. Oh my goodness, so I'm going to have to really run through my story here. In terms of our conversations, we were getting worried about this. We were starting to talk to them about this and say, those shareholder resolutions you're coming out with, out of the blue, there's no conversation with us, there's no conversation with people on the ground, are invading people's struggles. You're actually interfering in their struggles and in their agency. And by doing that, you're actually interfering with their ability to achieve the goals that they're actually setting, because you're not asking for the things they're actually asking for, you're asking for all these other little things that the company is willing to do. Then that may actually work out for the company. And this came to a head with Goldcorp's Marlin Mine, and given the time, I'm going to have to go through this rather quickly, but terrible mine in Guatemala, violence-ridden, social problems, and environmental contamination issues. So bad that Michael Jancey's research associates at the time actually called that Goldcorp ineligible for SRI portfolios, which is pretty rare when that ever happens. So that's how bad this particular mine is. That one of these SRIs at least could have broke ranks and said, you know what, you really can't hold this company if you want to be serious about having an ethical investment. Nonetheless, this consortium was created of a bunch of folks that are here that I won't read out, and they put forward a shareholder resolution. And again, this came after some conversations with the company and no conversations with people on the ground who had their own. They had held their own referendums. They had had their own scientific reports done. Their referendum said they didn't want the company to expand, and they wanted the damage that had been done to them to be compensated, the health impacts, the river impacts to be cleaned up, to be taken care of. Those were the very concrete things they were asking for. And this consortium came out with the idea that the company, after conversations with the company, should conduct a big 2-year-long study on human rights impacts. Nobody on the ground asked for this. The tensions on the ground were so great, this was supposed to be an iterative process where the people on the ground would actually participate. They would actually provide information to these researchers that were going to get hired by this consortium of ethical investor people. And we knew how tense things were on the ground. And we knew that this was just going to be like throwing a match into a tinderbox. This was going to increase violence. And so again, we quietly started talking to them. Before this actually became a reality, I was talking to some of these folks behind the scenes saying, don't do this. You've made a number of these kinds of mistakes before, but this one's really, really bad. Don't do this. And I was told basically, politely, that I didn't know what I was talking about, and that if things did go sideways in the way that I was predicting, you know, being such a doom and gloom kind of person, then they would surely pull out. So things went downhill from there. They did go in, they hired a firm to go and do that human rights impact assessment. The violence increased in the community, it got really ugly. One of the members of that consortium was the Public Service Alliance of Canada. It was their Canada staff pension fund that was involved. And we figured of everyone who was there, they were the ones we might be able to really go and talk to. And so a number of people really did go and have some serious conversations there. And to the great credit of PSAC, they pulled out of this little consortium. And that was significant, because that was high profile. You know, they pulled out. And they not only pulled out, but they actually made a really important statement. They said that they'd become increasingly concerned that the human rights impact assessment process and its relationship with the local communities. We've been especially concerned about the lack of free, prior, and informed consent of the communities in regard to it. So they actually recognizing these people never asked for this. This is not their goal. And that the interests of Goldcorp are being put before the interests of the local people. The firm that was hired to, then the BBC got involved. They actually started focusing on this, and they interviewed Bob Walker of Ethical Funds, and he actually admitted that the human rights impact assessment had had the unintended consequence of inflaming the situation. But even though the Public Service Alliance of Canada pulled out, and that also pulled Share out, because Share was the advisor to the Public Service Alliance of Canada. So two of the consortium were now out. The rest said, yeah, and the rest were admitting that there were extra problems, but they carried on. And the firm that they hired to do the actual assessment concluded that the conditions necessary to engage local communities and organizations in open dialogue do not exist. So, you know, they're supposed to be doing a human rights impact assessment, but the conditions were so bad on the ground that even the firm that was, you know, silly and stupid enough to take this contract said, we can't really do this. So from bad to worse one, they did plow on, and they did put out a document. But this time, Ethical Funds, which was now rolled into NEI, had really felt like it was under fire. So all the people who'd been critiquing the company in that project were now also critiquing them for having joined forces with the company. So they became very defensive, and they become greater and greater friends of the company. They were sort of like, when you talk to them, it was like you were talking to the company. And it got really ugly when an actual shareholder resolution that actually represented the asks of the people was brought forward in 2011. This was after the whole human rights impact assessment fiasco was over. Some real organizations in Canada that have strong links to those communities put forward a shareholder resolution that actually did reflect the demands and needs of the people. And NEI, you know, Ethical Funds is now in NEI, stands up at the shareholder meeting and opposes the shareholder resolution of these other people, of these people who are really linked to the grassroots. The company didn't even have to speak for itself. I mean, it said, let's not do this, but it was NEI that stood up. And there were people protesting outside. People had come in from Guatemala. They had a demonstration outside. They had people inside the shareholder meeting shaking, but speaking up for themselves. And NEI stands up and says, we're assured that Goldcorp is moving forward on the recommendations in the report. This is from the Human Rights Impact Assessment, which, by the way, they never did, and on its obligations to respect human rights wherever it operates. This was like blanket good company here. And it wasn't even the company that had to say it. It was one of the socially responsible investment companies. From bad to worse too, from there, NEI got really upset with what they considered to be activist investors who weren't them, basically. And started slamming them for frivolous resolutions, including that one that they had just put down. And they actually put out a little publication called, "Will the Real Investors Please Stand Up?" And by that they meant themselves, not these people from the community and their NGO supporters. And they actually said in 2011, this was, "A new type of shareholder activism has become increasingly common, with individual shareholders filing proposals while seeking support from other investors." Like, that's what they really hated, the fact that we actually tried to get some other investors to join and support that real resolution. The demands tend to be more closely linked to the campaigns of social and environmental groups. That is very unfair. What they really should have said, closer linked to what people on the ground are asking for, right? But that they really don't want to say. Then to the corporate objective of sustainable value creation.
Yeah.
So it's like, whoa. Bad to worse 3, I'm really going to have to hurry up here, but there's another part, I'll skip that. So, and then they take it another step. And they say, you know, these shareholder resolutions, because when they do a shareholder resolution, it's in the public realm. We can actually see what they're asking for. And then we can do one of two things. We can either say, hey, that's quite good. And then 10 years later say, how come you never got it and how come you're still invested? Or we can say, that's really scuzzy. You can't ask for that. That's suiting the company that's going to undermine agency at the local level. It's all very public. So now they put out another publication saying that really shareholder resolutions are a blunt instrument, which they may or may well be. And they start talking about themselves as problem solvers, and that they say really our value is in thinking through solutions with the corporations. And we can do that behind closed doors, and we don't have to put out anything public so that you can see what we're talking about. And they say, you know, these shareholder resolutions are not very nice. Nobody likes to be backed into a corner, right? This is the SRIs that for years before that would always say, shareholder resolutions, we're tough, we're taking them, you know, we're taking them in. And then they say things like, seeing results, we are seeing so many results in our many dialogues that and the need to focus public attention through a shareholder resolution is no longer so important. So we've got a good relationship with these companies now. They're talking to us, we can just sit down in the boardroom and have our conversations. So this really takes what they're doing out of this public scrutiny. I'm going to skip through these, why resolutions have been opposed by communities. I'm just going to run through this. So this is the last slide, implications for pension funds. You know, a lot of the big union pension funds and a lot of the church pension funds are still relying on these SRI folks to tell them what to do. And there are people, at least within the churches where I'm more familiar, that are becoming very concerned about this. And that are actually saying, you know what, we're kind of ready to divest at this point. You know, we've kind of been watching, in this case, Goldcorp and this Marlin mine. One of the churches has actually reached a point where they kind of want to divest, and they wanted to put that forward. And Share stepped in and said, I wouldn't do that if I were you. Bad idea. And talked about fiduciary responsibility, but also just talked about the fact that they were making Goldcorp change and things were going in the right direction. And so, you know, I guess in different ways we've all said the same thing. These SRI folks are a bit of a problem. But I think, you know, for unions that want to use the holdings that are in pension funds to make a difference, I at this point would say, don't go to these folks to tell you what to do. I guess that's it.